some of the most radical Muslims on the planet. He's all over YouTube. He's wanted dead by different ones. Until the Lord's finished with him, the Lord ain't going to let him go nowhere. And we're privileged to have him tonight. Let's just welcome our brother Jay Smith.
How's the vein, yeah?
Well, this is the first time I've ever talked to any gypsies.
Amen.
There's not just one or two. A whole room full. Terrific. Can you all hear me back there? As you can tell, I'm not from here. Though you would think, and I assume you think that I'm from America. However, I may sound like an American, but I've spent only 10 years of my life in America. I was born in India. I grew up in India. My parents were born in India. My grandparents come from India. I'm third generation Indian. And I understand some of you actually trace your lineage back to India. So we may be related. But when I'm in India, I talk like this, you know. So what are you doing? White man talking like this. I switch back and forth depending on where I am. But here in London, I've been here for 20 years, primarily taking on radical Muslims. That's why I was invited in 1992 to come here, because no one really knew who these gals and guys were. They didn't know where they were coming from. They didn't understand them. And I do, because I have worked for 30 years working with them, and I have been studying them, and I have learned their material. I have learned and I've been studying their book, the Quran. Now, I never asked permission to bring this book in this room. I guess it's okay. Don't worry, it's not going to hurt anybody. I prayed over it, and it's absolutely hopeless as a book, and that's why I confront this book everywhere I go. I was at Speaker's Corner yesterday, up on the ladder, and I had this book above my head, and I had the Bible next to it on either side, and I'm always confronting this book, because this is the book that causes all the problems. What I've been doing for the last 30 years is trying to help other people learn how to confront this book. We'll get into that, but before I want to do that, I want to ask, I want to share a story that happened a few years ago. We had a young man that you would come down to Speaker's Corner back in the 1990s, up until the millennium. He was there. He'd be coming down almost every Sunday, and he would engage with others on my team. His name was Asaf Hanif. Any of you know that name, Asaf Hanif? You probably don't. Asaf Hanif used to come down to Speaker's Corner. He'd be down in the crowd. One of my students named Ben got close with him, became good friends with him. He took him home to meet his parents, and so did Ben do the same thing. And then in October of 2002, suddenly he disappeared. We were told that he had gone to Syria to learn Arabic. Good place to learn Arabic. And then in April of 2003, his picture was on the cover of every newspaper here in Britain. Asaf Hanif, along with another man named Omar Sharif, not the actor, this is another Omar. Omar Sharif had gone to Israel, and had gone to Tel Aviv in Israel, and they tried to go into a boutique, one of these discotheques. Inside, there were about 200 people dancing in this discotheque called Mike's Bar. They were stopped at the door by some bouncers. Asaf Hanif, who had a jacket like I have on today, pulled the pin on his jacket, blew himself up, and killed 3 Israeli guards right there at the door. Omar Sharif tried to do the same thing with his jacket. It was a dud, and so nothing exploded. And so he jumped into the ocean and drowned. Now, how many people remember that incident? It was on the cover of all the newspapers in April of 2003. All over the United Kingdom, people were asking, what were these 2 men, these 2 English Muslims, what were they doing over in Tel Aviv, blowing themselves up and killing these Israelis? Why in Israel? And I want to know the answer as well. We had known Asaf Hanif. So I went down to Speaker's Corner that Sunday, and I held their 2 pictures up. I first went from ladder to ladder. If you come down to Speaker's Corner, Joe, you've been down there already. You know what it's like. You've been there and you've seen what we've been doing. We get up on a little ladder. In fact, it only gets us about, one of these kitchen ladders, it gets us about 2 steps up. I'm about as high as I am right now. Gets our heads above the crowd. And that's the reason for it, so that you can talk to the crowd. And as I went from ladder to ladder to ladder, no one was talking about what had just happened the week before. So I got up on my ladder and I held their pictures up. both of them up there. And I said, I want to talk about these two men. Who wants to talk about them? And immediately I sucked all the crowds from the other ladders, and they all came right to my ladder. And I said, I want all the Muslims to come front and center. I want to talk to you Muslims especially. I said to the Muslims that were there, how many of you Muslims support what these two men did this last week? And about 30 raised their hands. So I said, how many of you have raised your hands? How many of you are willing to blow yourselves up right here at Speaker's Corner for your God? And about 15 raised their hands. And they start punching the air, yelling, Allahu Akbar, Alhamdulillah. God be praised. God is the greatest. As this was happening, the crowd doubled and tripled. And I looked at the faces of the people that were in the crowd, and they were staring in horror as they were listening to these young men yelling Allahu Akbar and realizing what they were saying and why they were saying it. And I turned to the crowd and I said, look at the faces of these men. Memorize these faces. This is not a faceless enemy over there in Afghanistan or in Iraq. This is here in London. And these men are willing to blow themselves up for their God. What are you going to do about it? Now that was back in 2003. You know what happened 2 years later? 2005. 4 young men came down to London, blew themselves up on 3 different trains, 1 bus. I was down there in Edgware Road. As I was coming in, I was going to do a lecture in central London that day. I was stopped by the police, so I had to get out of my car and start walking out across Edgware Road as they were bringing the bodies out in their with their silver blankets over top of them. And I remember hearing at that time that there were actually 2 other, in fact at that time there were 3 other explosions. And immediately I said, this has to be Islam. I didn't know what others knew at that time. How could we have known it that early? I knew it had to be Islam, because you don't have that kind of concerted effort. You don't have it on that large of a scale unless there's something much deeper going on. Now, right now, in Belmarsh Prison here in London, there's 149 young men who are in prison. Every one of them have been caught either making bombs, exploding bombs, or transporting bombs. Some of them you already know about. One of them was an attempt very close to here in Bluewater. Those young men that tried to use that fertilizer bomb, they were caught before they could do it, thank God, and that's why Bluewater still exists. And you've all heard about the backpack bombers. They actually did succeed in 2005, those 4 young men. 2 weeks later, 5 other young men tried to do the very same thing, remember that? And they took their bombs in their backpacks, went on 5 different trains. The detonators went off, but because fortunately the material for the bombs itself had deteriorated within the intervening 2 weeks. And thank God there was no destruction. They're also in prison. Then you've heard about the liquid bombers, those who try to destroy those planes at Heathrow Airport. That's why we don't take liquids on board planes anymore. And how about the medical bombers? Remember those medical students, those 4 young medical students who tried to blow up 2 pubs here in London and try to blow up Glasgow Airport? Remember that? And then the shoe bomber from Brixton who tried to blow up that shoe there on that Air France. And then, of course, the underwear bomber who tried to blow up that plane landing at Detroit, who did his training here at UCL. All of these are young men who are now in our prisons here. Every one of those 149 young men are Muslims. And every one of them, except for 4, are British citizens. This is not a problem overseas. This is not something that's over there that we don't have to worry about. It's now right here. And this is your problem too, because here's the question that everybody's asking. I hear it all over the place. How are we going to deal with these young men that want to blow themselves up? How are we going to deal with these young men that seem to be disenfranchised? They're not disenfranchised, folks. Listen, Asaf Hanif has a degree from Kingston University, well, had when he was living. Almost every one of those 149 young men are Pakistanis and Indians, Bangladeshis. They're from the Asian subcontinent, where I grew up, where my parents grew up. I understand them better than most because I've grown up amongst them. I spent my first 17 years was there. I was born there, and I have to deal with them day in and day out. And they're the ones I argue with. They're the ones I debate with. I was just there yesterday, up on the ladder, and I was introducing a whole new book, and I hear them, and I yell them. I hear them yelling at me, and I hear what they're saying, and I know exactly what motivates them. And it always comes back to this book. Now, here's the problem. People are asking, how are we going to deal with radical Islam? And I would suggest that most of the things most people I'm hearing usually have one of 2 solutions. The first solution is that radical Islam is not a problem that we can deal with. Radical Islam is nothing more than a reaction to political problems that are happening around